All right. Thanks for everyone who has already joined today's Biocurator Working Group meeting. For today's call, we have Alicia and Tam here to present an overview of the kidney diseases GCEPs and VCEPs, so overviews and updates from that clinical domain working group. As for announcements, we have kind of one main announcement. So we have the results from the working group poll that we sent out a few weeks ago, asking for some new meeting times. And there was one that had an overwhelming support for. So we will be moving meeting times for the second week meetings to the second Wednesdays from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. So because of that, our next meeting will be on Wednesday, March 8th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. I will be going and changing the calendar holds before that next meeting. And as of right now, we have planned for Marina DiStefano to speak with us about the Gene Curation Coalition, or GenCC. So those are the main announcements. We will be meeting at that new meeting time starting on our next call in 2 weeks. And I think that was it. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen now and hand it over to Tam and Alicia for their presentation.
Thanks, Amanda. And if anyone has any questions, concerns about the time change, feel free to reach out or message. We will still be recording this as we always do. We just really wanted to try to be inclusive of those individuals who are in other time zones, that this is the middle of the night for them. Alicia, formerly being like that, can understand and collaborate with that. So excited to hear from Alicia and Tam now.
Thank you. Tam is on, isn't he? I'm sure I saw his name.
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. So I will go ahead and share my screen. That is the screen I want to share. But yeah, so Tam and I are two of the senior coordinators within the kidney disease clinical domain work group. And I believe this is the first time that this working group has presented on the Biocurator working group call. So we thought that we would share a bit of an overview of the domain as a whole and take you through the various expert panels that we have within our domain, highlight some of the challenges and the solutions we've come up to them to hopefully help other people on the call who might have encountered the same situations. But I will hand over to Tam to kick us off, as he really has been with the kidney disease clinical domain from its very inception, as he will tell you about. And I've joined the group a little later on. I'll hand over to Tam.
All right, thanks, Alicia. Great, thank you. Okay, so I thought I'd start with just a little bit about the history. I think a lot of different clinical domain working groups get established for different reasons. Sometimes there's like a VCEP that wants to get started, or there's funding for a specific domain group. But the kidney disease clinical domain working group, I think, was maybe slightly different. And the sort of the story behind how we got started is that way back in 2018, Dr. Andrew Mallet, who is the director of the Australian KidGen Collaborative, and this is a national kidney genomics program in Australia. Now they've worked with Genomics England and PanelApp, and they've curated a number of gene panels that are used within the Australian healthcare system. And they also actually took PanelApp, and they now have an Australian PanelApp, and that's part of the GenCC, which Marina is going to talk about at the next meeting. So Dr. Mallet is well-established nephrologist in this domain, and he reached out to ClinGen. And from looking back at the email, it seems like particularly the cardiovascular domain working group was what caught his eye in terms of the publications and sort of how prolific they were. I'm not sure back in 2018 how many clinical domain working groups there were, but he reached out and basically said, is ClinGen thinking about doing this for kidney disease? Well, at that point we hadn't, and these emails sort of, go through the ClinGen grapevine, and I don't think we really have any expertise in-house on cardiovascular or hearing loss or anything. However, at this time I was working in Heidi's group, and I had, as part of my curation efforts, curated PKD1 and PKD2, mostly because they were my favorite genes. And this sort of group goes full circle because my PhD way back when was with Dr. Peter Harris, and I was looking at characterizing the duplicated or the CNV regions, including PKD1, to help with the clinical testing and finding of variants in there. Anyway, we'll get to Peter Harris in a second. So Heidi approached me and I said, yeah, I'd be happy to be involved in getting this up and running. Now, Dr. Mallet, as Alicia will attest to, he is very charismatic. He is super enthusiastic. He's very good at reaching out to people. So between that November 2018 and the following year at the Kidney Week in Washington, DC, we got together, I think it was about maybe 20 international nephrologists, and these were all people who were interested in leading some kind of like GCEP or VCEP within this domain working group. And so ClinGen hosted a dinner with these folks and also a breakfast for those who couldn't attend. So there was a good group of people, a lot of enthusiasm, and that was basically when the idea of this disease working group came about. Obviously, at this point, there's no specific funding, and it was, I think, the year later that ClinGen put in supplemental grant applications for the Broad Institute to help support the efforts of this group. So then from the initial email, I think it was a year and a half, and then the first kidney disease, the gene curation expert panel was approved, which is the Cystic and Ciliopathy panel, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So like most clinical domain working groups, the aims were to validate genes, specifically in this case implicated in kidney disease, through the generation of gene curation expert panels, and also to develop kidney disease specific specifications for the ACMG AMP guidelines, and to perform expert curation for variant pathogenicity, resolving conflicts and aggregating evidence to accurately interpret variants through the variant curation expert panels, which Alicia will talk about. And so to date, we have 5 GCEPs. This was always, I think, Dr. Mallet's intention. There was already 5 well scoped out sort of subclinical domains within nephrology that we wanted to encompass. And then currently two VCEPs, and these are for the 2 most common inherited diseases. So Alport's and polycystic kidney disease. All right, next slide, please. So this is the current leadership team. So I have Matt Sampson on the far right there. So initially, I guess 3 or so years back, Dr. Mallet and Andrew Sampson were the 2 co-chairs of this group. Matt Sampson has stepped down, and we are very happy to welcome Rachel Lennon from the University of Manchester in the UK, and Sunitsa Stark from Melbourne in Australia. Oh, and I should mention that Dr. Mallet is in, where is he? He is in Queensland, so he's also in Australia. And I will get to mention the time zone issue. So in terms of the meeting formats, there's a leadership meeting, so between these 3 and the coordinators once per month. About twice a year, we try and get the leadership team and the co-chairs of all the expert panels together. And then once or twice per month, and myself and Alicia will get into this in terms of each GCEP and VCEP has sort of a different schedule. And then we try annually to have a meeting, like a town hall meeting for everybody. Obviously, during COVID, this has been virtual, but we hope to kind of coincide that with the American Society of Nephrology or Kidney Week, which happens in November. Next slide. So these faces are probably familiar to everybody on this Biocuration call. These are all the coordinators. So as we say, we have 5 GCEPs and 2 VCEPs. So everybody here does a lot of work on, across several of these GCEPs and VCEPs. As Alicia mentioned, I've started the Cystic GCEP, but I am actually stepping down from coordination of that. So I want to thank Vanessa for stepping up into that place. She'll be taking over coordination for the Cystic GCEP. Next slide, please. This is just an overview of our membership. So this data was obtained from the GPM downloads. So currently we have, across all of those GCEPs and VCEPs, we have 128 members. These members come from 23 different countries, which, as you can see on the map, is a nightmare for time zones. We also have some very enthusiastic people who are involved in more than one GCEP or VCEP. So there's 48 people who are involved in more than one VCEP, and there are 17 people who are involved in 3 or more GCEPs or VCEPs. So we have a lot of dedication. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first GCEP, this is the first one that started, and as you can see at the bottom there is Peter Harris. So I think part of this was kind of instigated by the fact that Peter was my PhD supervisor many years ago. He's also a leader in polycystic kidney disease. And so he was committed from the start to being one of the co-leads of the cystic and ciliopathy GCEP disorder. Ciliopathy disorders GCEP, sorry. So the scope of work that we had was to curate genes associated with inherited cystic or tubulointerstitial diseases. These included the autosomal dominant and recessive polycystic kidney disorders, tubulointerstitial and fibrotic kidney diseases, such as ADTKD and nephronophthisis, cystic diseases majorly infecting the liver, which are the autosomal dominant polycystic liver diseases. And then subsequently what we're working on now is the syndromic disorders, which are due to defects in the functioning of primary cilia, or ciliopathies as we like to call them, that have cystic or MPHP kidney phenotypes. So these include Joubert, Meckel, body beetle, but I'll speak to that in some of the challenges. So we currently have 32 members. These include 15 biocurators and 17 expert members, although we do have some expert members that like to biocurate as well, and they're from 12 different countries. So the current three co-leads are Tony Blair, Emily Konaktagal, and Peter Harris. Peter's been there since the start. The other two stepped in last year, so we've rotated the other two. Next slide, please. So what we've achieved so far, as I say, we launched in May 2020. We have 2 meetings per month. Because of the time difference, we have one at 8 a.m. and one at 5 p.m. However, everybody is quite committed, and I usually see the same people on each call, so I don't know when they sleep. In terms of genes in scope, we originally had 121 genes. There was actually 3 that were published with new associations since we started, so we added those and wanted to curate those as quick as possible, see what extra evidence was out there. To date, we've approved 46 gene disease relationships, and we have a publication in process for those first 3 that I listed on the last slide. So these are 5 associated with ADPLD, 7 with ADPKD, 3 with ARPKD, 4 with ADTKD, and 17 with the nephronophthisis genes. So about half of these are definitive, and we actually started with some of the more well-known ones to make sure we got those curated and just to familiarize people with the curation process. About 10% of those were strong, 10% moderate, and 6% limited. So in terms of specific challenges for this GCEP, so this was the first one of this clinical domain working group. So Mondo, I don't think for the nephrology kind of tree had been well defined. So we had early discussions with Mondo, brought in Andrew Mallet and some key players to kind of give the Mondo folks some resources that they might use to help kind of get that in better shape. And that's come a long way. As a coordinator for a GCEP, the main challenge I have is getting people to write the evidence summaries. So we have a lot of enthusiasm for curation, and the curators are outstanding. They do a great job. But getting the evidence summaries after they've presented is a little challenging. And actually, there was one case where we were actually scooped, and another GCEP had published on a gene that we had already signed off as moderate in a call, but then they got to publish it first. Fortunately, we agree on the classification, but we would have perhaps talked about naming it something different. Then there's also the issue with curator turnover. So we do have some curators that have been with us since the start, which is great, but it does take a lot of sort of hand-holding and kind of to train up a curator if they're only going to be with us to do a couple of curations and then leave. It's a lot of effort. And I think that also maybe has slowed us down somewhat because we tend to like the curators to, it could take a long time. For new curators, we like to have them present. So we haven't done a lot of kind of fast tracking of any of our curations. Then what do I have? coordination of curations of syndromic genes, right? So the first 36 that we're publishing on were fairly much completely in scope for kidney disease, whereas once we get into the syndromic genes, it gets a little more tricky to kind of adjudicate who's going to take them. So I think like the Bardet-Biedl syndrome genes, the retina GCEP wanted those, so we transferred 20 of those to the retina GCEP. We did do one joint curation with the monogenic diabetes GCEP, and then we're working with the syndromic GCEP on some of the other genes. And then interestingly, we did look into curating carrier phenotypes for biallelic disorders, such as MPHP1. And also sort of the reverse, the embryonically lethal or neonatal onset of biallelic disorders for like PKD1 and PKD2, and just thinking about sort of the genetic counseling and testing of those genes. And we're going to be submitting an abstract to the CCG this year. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah, so I'll pass it over to Alicia.
Yeah. I did just want to comment quickly on a couple of the points in the chat, and like Tam and I are very happy to, I guess, stop throughout this if people want to jump in with questions, or if there's anything we've said that resonates with your experience, or you have something to add or have questions, like I said. But yeah, the point about having the evidence summaries templates being helpful, and also that they take a long time, we completely take that. And we have found that having that for the gene curation as well as for the variant curation, those templates are super helpful, and it's definitely made the process slightly less painful getting summaries from our curators. But honestly, it seems to be like the pressure of you have to present this to a group of people tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. means slides are made and they're ready to present, but without having any way to really impose a firm deadline other than just we'll be angry at you if you don't have this done, it just makes it tricky. So if any groups out there, coordinators, chairs, or anything on the call have tips for how you motivate your curators to make sure that evidence summary is done and these curations can actually be published, we would love to hear them. But I will move on to talking about the rest of the expert panels within the kidney domain. So as Tam said, he was really there from the start of the clinical domain work group, those very early meetings, and getting not just the cystic GCEP up and running, but really the structure for the whole of the clinical domain. And then I came on board and joined the ClinGen team in mid-2020, and then since then have become the kidney person within the Broad ClinGen team. So I sit across all of the clinical domains expert panels. So starting off with the Tubulopathy GCEP, this was the next one that got launched after the cystic group. And so the scope of this panel's work is to assess genes associated with disorders of water, iron, or other transport pathways that specifically impact the nephron segment from the proximal tubule to the terminal collecting duct. So the way the expert panels within the kidney group have been separated out is they're dealing with very specific either sections of the nephron or specific kidney phenotype. So I actually really quite like the way that this was such a well thought out and planned separation of expert panels. So the tubulopathy group deals with the renal tubules. And the way that it prioritized their genes, they're initially focusing on disorders that arrive from altered expression or function of genes that are expressed in the renal tubule. And then we're moving on to address disorders that arise from genes that are expressed elsewhere in the body, but then impact the function in the renal tubule. So we have really consistent members across the couple of years that this panel has been running. We have 23 members who regularly attend all of our meetings. And of that, we have 9 biocurators, 14 expert members across 7 countries. And I really did want to highlight here, across all of our expert panels, we have wonderful volunteer biocurators. Like most of the work we do is done by volunteers. Completing the evidence summaries things aside, these volunteers are absolutely wonderful, and we've been lucky within tubulopathy that people who have been there from the start are still with us now and curating regularly. So we have 3 chairs again for this group, so Detlef Bockenhauer and Fiona Carrott in the UK, and then Christy Thomas here in the US. Again, they've been with the panel since the start. And across multiple countries, we have issues with scheduling, but what we have found is that this 5 p.m. Eastern time is this magic slot, which is just slightly awful for everyone. Like, it's the end of the day in the US, it's the beginning of the day in Australia, like sometimes it's 7 a.m. or 9 a.m. depending on the time, daylight saving, and it's late at night in the UK. So sort of everyone has a bad time if you meet at 5 p.m. And everyone's happy to be showing up for that, knowing that we're all equally poorly impacted. But we meet twice per month. We have 56 genes in scope so far. We've gone through close to 30 of them. So we are actually expecting to finish our entire scope of work by the end of this year. And then, as Tam discussed, some of the specific challenges that the Cystic GCEP has faced within the Tubulopathy GCEP. Actually, as I go through all of these remaining GCEPs, I've chosen to focus on just one specific challenge throughout all of them, because I think many of them are common across them all. So just highlighting one per panel, but this issue that I'm about to discuss for the tubulopathy group is also encountered in complement, it's encountered in glomerulopathy. But probably the biggest challenge we came across early in tubulopathy was around the skewed weighting in the gene curation SOP against gain of function mechanisms. So if you have a loss of function variant, the default, or null variant, the default score for that is 1.5 points. You upgrade it for functional, you're 2 point, and you can very easily max out your genetic evidence if it's a loss of function mechanism. For gain of function mechanisms, normally caused by missense variants, the default scoring there is only a 0.1. If you have functional support, you're adding an additional 0.4, but you need lots of examples to be able to get your curation to a strong definitive level. And particularly because these gain of function mechanisms are related to specific interactions, it's often not going to be that many missense variants within the gene that will lead to a disease phenotype. So we came across quite a few of our diseases now that were only coming out as limited because there were a small number of variants reported, even though they had really extensive characterization, and the community felt that, well, the experts on the panel felt that these should be strong or definitive. By the scoring, they just weren't able to get there. So there was, of course, the option for us to manually override this final classification and call it what the community thought it was. What I have learned is nephrologists are sticklers for the rules, and they did not like the idea of just, we're going to manually override this based on our expert opinion. So they wanted to come up with a way that we could consistently, systematically score how we were seeing gain of function variants to get these curations to either where they thought they should be or a more appropriate classification. So what we've settled on is that for these missense variants that have a gain of function effect, where gain of function is the well-established mechanism for the disease, so not just it's thought to be gain of function, but where there are multiple lines of evidence that are demonstrating a gain of function mechanism between the gene and then causing the disease. We've elected to upgrade that functional support score from 0.4 to 0.9. And again, stressing that's only if it is really well established that gain of function is the mechanism and you're seeing functional studies that support gain of function as an effect. And so that means that our missense variants in gain of function mechanism diseases are now scoring 1 point each, which is somewhat more akin to the 1.5 that you see for loss of function variants. And it means that a number of these curations that were previously stuck at limited are moderate. I think a couple of them have even got to strong definitive, which is really where the experts believe that they should be. And it also means that the experts are happy because they're not just manually overriding it, they can actually point to the scoring that they've used consistently across all of the expert panels within the kidney clinical domain that has moved this, what was previously a limited relationship, up to strong or definitive. So as I said, this is now something that all of the GCEPs across the kidney clinical domain are using. Next up was the Glomerulopathy GCEP. So this launched about a month after the Tubulopathy group. And this panel is assessing genes that are associated with glomerular disorders and the altered function of podocytes, endothelial cells, mesangial cells, and the glomerular basement membrane. So all those components that make up the glomerulus. Again, initially focusing on disorders that arise from altered expression within the glomerulus, and then secondarily addressing disorders that arise from genes expressed elsewhere but impact the function of that glomerular filtration barrier. So again, wonderful, consistent membership here, 25 members turning up to almost every call, 13 biocurators, 12 expert members. And again, like Tam said, we do have some of our expert members who are really quite senior in the field, but are super keen to be curating for us as well, which is really wonderful to see. And again, representation from a lot of countries across the world. And our chairs here, we have Kathy Quinlan in Australia, Martin Pollock in the US, and Rachel Lennon, who's in the UK. So the Glomerulopathy GCEP, as I said, launched in March. We alternate our calls here between 7 a.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Eastern twice a month, just to try to support that really global membership and having everyone who wants to attend be able to join. We have 157 genes, 34 of them so far. And the biggest challenge that I wanted to call out within this panel is around disease naming. Tam mentioned this a little as well. And so this challenge of disease naming is definitely not something that's specific to the glomerulopathy GCEP. It's across all of the kidney GCEPs. It's across all of the clinical domains GCEPs. It's a problem, but I did want to highlight that in the glomerulopathy GCEP, the issue isn't so much related to the gene curation activities. So for other groups, like if they're doing lumping and splitting and there's disorders that have been traditionally thought of as separate disease entities, but through ClinGen's process of lumping and splitting should be considered a single entity, and we need to define a new name for that lumped disorder. The issue in glomerulopathy field specifically, and also across a lot of the kidney panels, is that there is just disease naming issues across the field in general, and people are wanting to change the name because the names don't accurately reflect the underlying biology, and it's not aligned with our contemporary knowledge of disease pathogenesis. And so this causes all sorts of downstream issues. So it's hindering clinical recognition, and it impacts patients oftentimes by restricting their ability to access appropriate care. So outside of our GCEPs, there are already conversations happening in the kidney disease field about wanting to rename certain disorders or rename certain phenotypic series. And so the formation of the glomerulopathy GCEP and our discussions internally about disease naming, and also in conjunction with the disease naming advisory committee within ClinGen, have actually come at a really wonderful time for the nephrology field, because they're looking to rename disorders. They're looking to do it across nephrology, but it's individual groups who are thinking about it. And so ClinGen has really been able to help there, because we're coming from a higher level sort of kidney disease clinical domain across all of these different disease areas, rather than just being super focused on, I want to rename Alport syndrome. So we've been able to reach out to multiple different patient groups, clinical organizations, so like KDIGO, which organizes conferences around controversies, big issues in the kidney disease field. We've been able to collaborate with these groups and help them to share sort of broader thinking around disease naming, so across all of kidney disease and also across genetic diseases in general, being able to bring in some of the experience from that advisory committee. But one of the examples I wanted to highlight within the glomerulopathy GCEP, so for example, focal segmental glomeruloscleropathy, or FSGS, is what a number of disorders are called. There's a whole phenotypic series of them, but the major issue here that the glomerulopathy field themselves highlighted and said we want to change its name is because FSGS isn't a disease. It's an observation of a phenotype at a point in time. So if you'd seen that patient a year earlier, maybe they'd have minimal change disease. If you see them 2 years later, you would call them as having end-stage renal disease. So FSGS isn't the disease name, and so that whole phenotypic series needs to be renamed to to something that is actually reflective of the disease and the disease process, not just that given phenotype. And additionally, disorders like Alport syndrome, our understanding of what constitutes Alport syndrome has changed over time. So it's not just that syndromic presentation. Some patients will only have hematuria, and that is all considered within the spectrum of Alport syndrome. But in terms of patient care, unless they tick the box and meet the tick box for Alport syndrome, they're not able to access a lot of the care that they really should in monitoring for the development of other symptoms. So conversation there within the Alport syndrome field is perhaps changing that name to something like Alport spectrum, so that there is immediate recognition that it is not just a syndromic presentation. There's other disorders that could comprise that as well. So lots of work within glomerulopathy around disease naming, but also across all of the kidney field. Next up is our complement-mediated diseases GCEP. So as implied by the name, they work with genes associated with complement-mediated kidney disease. So initially focusing on the thrombotic microangiopathies, so aHUS and C3 glomerulopathy. And then as a secondary priority, also considering other forms of thrombotic microangiopathies that aren't necessarily caused by the complement system, but related systems, and so like around the coagulation pathway. So we have 20 members here for Biocurator, 16 expert members. Our chairs are across England and the US. I must say that the complement group there's definitely some overlapping members to our other GCEPs, but I would say they are our most distinct group. And we're also very happy to have a number of immunologists joining this group as well. So it's been wonderful to get to collaborate quite closely with the immunology clinical domain. So this panel launched in March of last year. They are only meeting once per month, at a point that I'll get to in a moment as well, but I guess the bandwidth of people involved. So as I said, most people in this panel are unique to the complement group, but there are some who are across all of our other panels as well and want to be involved in everything kidney. And so finding a time that they're free, that fits in with the fact that they have whole other jobs, not just ClinGen, and then are also volunteering at sometimes 6 meetings a month already. It's been hard to find times to schedule here, but at the moment, meeting once per month, planning to increase this to twice per month at some point this year. And again, trying to find times in the afternoon, 3 p.m., 4 p.m. Eastern time, that is equally horrible for everyone. So they have 38 genes in scope. And we've been through 7 of these genes so far and assessing them each for those 2 disease assertions I mentioned before, so aHUS and C3G glomerulopathy. And you'll notice here that even though we've been up and running for nearly a full year, I haven't listed how many of those genes we've curated as definitive or moderate or strong, because the biggest challenge that we've come across here, and this is a challenge that is unique for the most part to the complement group, is that most of these disorders have non-Mendelian associations. Myself and Ryan, who coordinates this group with me, this is definitely not something that we were aware of, expecting when we started coordinating for this group. Like, right, we're across lots of other groups, and we were like, yes, you are going to curate your complement-mediated kidney disease genes by ClinGen's SOP, which is related to Mendelian disorders. And then there was sort of this miscommunication for a while of like, but these disorders aren't necessarily Mendelian. And so we've eventually come to learn that not all of these gene disease relationships are Mendelian. Some of them really are as susceptibility gene disease associations. So the biggest issue that we've had, and we're still working through exactly how we're doing this, which is why we haven't published any of our curations yet, because we want to make sure we're using a consistent process and we're happy with our approach here. The biggest challenge has been identifying which cases and variants we should be curating so that we can formally assert that this is a limited, a strong, or whatever Mendelian association between this gene and this disease, or being able to dispute it. So saying there is not a Mendelian association here, but perhaps there is a susceptibility. And then there's sort of that gray area in the middle as well, where it's not traditionally Mendelian, but it's a high enough risk association. Those variants have high enough penetrance that you can calculate a useful informative risk from it. So being able to curate those variants so we can have something useful out to the community about this is the relationship between this gene and this disease, and this is the implication that having a variant in that gene might have for your patient. And then future work here, of course, that I'm at least not aware of a way within ClinGen that we're formally addressing, would be to perhaps think about how we could formally curate the strength of evidence of supporting susceptibility associations. So in the same way that this complement-mediated kidney disease community really needs formal assessments of Mendelian relationships, it will be equally important and useful to have formal assessments of the strength supporting susceptibility associations between these genes and diseases. So that is our biggest challenge there. And then our final expert panel within the kidney disease clinical domain, well, final GCEP, is the congenital anomalies of the kidney and urinary tract. So early on, a developmental disorder and dealing with genes associated here with both isolated and syndromic forms of Cocoot. So obviously the isolated forms fall very firmly within the Cocoot scope of work. The syndromic forms can obviously interact with, overlap, with many of the other panels within ClinGen, specifically, of course, the syndromic GCEP. But yeah, so any disorder that's affecting the development of the kidney and urinary tract, we are interested in initially placing emphasis of our curations on those disorders where Cocoot is either the only or the major phenotypic feature, and then working really closely with some of those other panels to lend our kidney expertise to assessing a more syndromic feature. So we have 15 members here, 3 biocurators and 12 expert members, and our chairs, so Rashid, Julia, and Hila, come from US for Rashid and Hila, and then Julia is in Germany. We have quite a range of time zones here as well, and you'll notice that there is far less active members for this group. So there are only 15, and we have 3 biocurators, which is significantly less than what we've seen for our other groups. And that leads me into, and I'll talk about our specific challenges for this group first, is that we really have membership fatigue. So when the kidney clinical domain was launched, there was, I said at the start, this grand plan to have 5 clinical domains that cover the whole spectrum of nephropathies, which is a wonderful way to approach this. But with all of them running concurrently, it means that people are they have too much on their plate. And because it is so heavily volunteer driven, people eventually reach a time limit. And I think that Cocoot was the straw that broke the kidney disease clinical domain camel's back. So we've found it really hard to get this panel up and running. We launched in February, but we've only been meeting about once per month. Some months we've had to cancel our meetings because there's not been enough people on that we've felt we've had a quorum to really properly be assessing genes. So all of the panel members on Cocoot are members of at least one other kidney panel. There are some that are on 3 or 4, and what we've learned is that everyone is interested in Cocoot. Like, everyone wants to be involved in this and they care about this, but it's not their primary interest. Everyone's primary interest is one of our other panels. And then this is just something that they have a secondary interest in and want to turn up and contribute to when they have time, but they don't have time because they're doing all of the other panels. So as I said, these groups already have multiple people involved in this, have multiple meetings on their calendars already. And then our volunteer biocurators are also normally curating for 1 or 2 other panels already, so have limited amount of time to dedicate to doing the research needed and generating these curations. So our solution here that we're hoping is a solution, but we haven't trialed it yet, we're just about to start, is that because many of the genes on our Cocoot gene list overlap with the genes in other kidney expert panels is that we're going to trial having CCOOT themed meetings. So the chairs of our CCOOT GCEP have very specific expertise in CCOOT that are separate to the expertise of the chairs of those various other panels. And then the membership, as I'd said, normally overlaps between those other panels and CCOOT anyway. So we're thinking, hopefully, if we can have CCOOT themed meetings where we tackle one or two CCOOT gene-less genes, all the people are going to be there anyway, and see how that goes, because then we can formally put this out there as the CCOOT GCEP has assessed this, which is what we want. But we're trying to piggyback on meetings that are already scheduled. And alongside this, we will also still be having one meeting per quarter that is purely dedicated to just CCOOT. So those isolated phenotypes or ones where there's not overlap with other panels. So this is our proposed solution at the moment. We're not sure how this is going to go, but as I'd said, like, this is the fifth final area within the kidney disease clinical domain. It's a useful group. We need to be having these curations and filling this gap. So we want to be able to make this work. Again, I don't know if other people on this call have groups that have faced similar issues, if there's any tips there that you can share. But this is our approach that we're wanting to trial here. Very quickly showing our curation summary, and I've just realized our time, so I have 2 more panels to get through, and then I think we should actually be very well on time. But our VCEP, so as Tam mentioned at the start, we have 2 VCEPs currently, and they cover the 2 most common inherited kidney diseases. So firstly, the polycystic kidney disease VCEP, which is initially focusing on autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease caused by PKD1 and PKD2. So this is the most prevalent inherited kidney disease. And those 2 genes account for the majority of those cases. In future, this group will also widen its scope to include those other genes that are causative of ADPKD, and also consider recessive inheritance of PKD. So because this was our first VCEP, and I feel like people care about gene curation, people have a special sort of care and love for variant curation expert panels. So we have 27 wonderful members, 11 biocurators, 16 expert members, and our chairs here, Katie and Peter, come from Ireland and the US respectively. So we launched in November 2020. I think similar to a number of other VCEPs, like across other clinical domains, our meeting format is that we meet once per month as a small working group where we're able to have those really sort of nitty-gritty nuts and bolts discussions and really work through the key issues that we can come up with solutions with that we present to a wider group. So with just a few voices involved rather than trying to accommodate 30 different people's opinions. And then after those working group meetings, we meet as a whole panel once per month, where the decisions that were made at that working group meeting are taken to the whole panel for approval. Again, we alternate our meeting times here between that magic 5 p.m. slot I mentioned, and then also the 8 a.m. slot, which is, again, an equally horrible for everyone around the world. So at the moment, this VCEP has finished specifying for both PKD1 and PKD2. We're just going through a process of the members having a final opportunity to review this before we submit it to SVI review for step 2 approval to begin piloting, which we are all very excited for. But I guess the biggest challenge for this VCEP has been around meeting scheduling. So a theme that both myself and Tam mentioned, the Kidney Group is incredibly global, and we have membership across multiple time zones. We can't change global time zones, and so there's not a lot we can do to fix that, and it's just about what can we do to make it the easiest for multiple people to be involved, and the people who really want to actively contribute have the opportunity to do that. For GCEPs, that works quite well because the format of every meeting is the same. Like you're reviewing a gene disease association and you move on and you do the same process every meeting. VCEPs are a little different though, like you're talking about a different code every time. I guess you could say that's the same as talking about a different gene every time in a GCEP meeting, but some people care more or less about certain genes But for VCEPs, even if you're talking about a different code, it's still for that same gene, which they love and want to be there and involved in those conversations. So I feel VCEPs present an extra special challenge around scheduling for time zones. And so we are trying to alternate, like I said, between that 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. slot. But even that like 8 a.m. is sometimes midnight in Australia, or sometimes it'll be 10 a.m., but it's just hard for people to involve, and there's no solution to it. It's just people being dedicated and really wanting to turn up, unfortunately. And I guess this isn't a conversation that can happen asynchronously. It's not like you can split up your meeting and have that same conversation across 2 time zones. That was something we floated to our membership, and they had really said, like, no, we don't want to do that. Like, I'm in Australia, I interact with Australians and other people in the Asia Pacific to have these conversations anyway. I want to talk to the people in Europe. I want to talk to the people in the US live. So again, I don't know if other people have solutions for how you manage that, but we're just trying and relying on our wonderful members being up in the middle of the night. And then our final VCEP is our Alport Syndrome VCEP. So this group is only just currently in the process of launching, and its scope of work is, of course, focusing on these 3 genes that are implicated in Alport syndrome. So collagen 4A5, which causes X-linked form, and then 4A3 and 4A4, which can cause both autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive Alport syndrome. We have really country involvement here from 11 countries, and a lot in Asia Pacific that we haven't seen in our other panels yet as well. So across Korea and Singapore and China. We have 8 biocurators, 15 expert members, and really excitingly, we have a really motivated, engaged patient who is volunteering as one of our biocurators, which is the first patient within the kidney group that I know of that's actively biocurating. So as I said, this group is only currently in the process of launching. We are just about to submit our step 1 application, but we have met a couple of times as a group just to discuss what the ClinGen process looks like, to make sure that we're encouraging membership across people's networks and things, but we are hoping to be properly up and running very shortly. Again, continuing with that working group and whole group alternating format of meetings. And then, of course, because we haven't really launched yet, there's not specific challenges other than the sort of standard meeting scheduling ones I've already mentioned, but I guess the specific ones that we're anticipating here related to the disease naming issue that I mentioned before for Alport syndrome, is around defining what is the disease. So what is the minimal phenotype that we're wanting to curate for here? So Alport syndrome isn't just that syndromic presentation. It can be patients who just present with isolated hematuria, but do we want to say, like, is every patient with hematuria who has a collagen 4 variant, is that Alport syndrome? Is that just like, there's a lot to tease out there that we're about to get into. So what is that minimal phenotype that we want to curate for? And then also there's known variable expressivity of phenotypes. So as I mentioned before, collagen 4A5 is X-linked, and X-linked females can be completely unaffected, as you would expect for an X-linked carrier. Some will have that very mild hematuria phenotype, but then some females will have syndromic Alport syndrome, even though other females within their same family are completely unaffected. And it's not well understood why there is that variable expressivity. So we're expecting that as we're going through the specification process, knowing how to account for that in our specifications is possibly going to throw up some issues. Maybe it won't, but we're hoping to be prepared for it. So that is all of our expert panels within the kidney disease clinical domain, our 5 GCEPs, our 2 VCEPs. And then just quickly to wrap up some future directions. So, and Tam, if you want to jump in here at all, please do. But for continued operations, as far as GCEPs go, as I said, we're covering all of inherited kidney diseases under the ones we already have. So we're not planning to launch any more GCEPs. And if Kahoot is anything to learn by, we possibly have one too many on the go at once anyway. And we have 2 of those VCEPs that are covering the 2 most common inherited kidney diseases. So we're not planning formally to launch anymore, but we are, of course, open to, if we have motivated individuals within our membership who want to start one for their disease of interest, we're happy to support that. And then obviously ongoing operations for those existing GCEPs. For conferences, we plan to continue attending and having a visible presence, not only at genetics focused meetings where ClinGen most frequently would pop up, but also at those kidney disease focused meetings. So like at ASM, where this first concept for the clinical domain was launched, and there really is increasing interest within the nephrology field for genetics. Just the number of genetics themed sessions at the last ASN meeting was considerably more at the ones that had been before that. And I think knowing that the planning that's coming through for this year is more, there's definitely an interest in this. So we're keen for ClinGen as a whole to have a presence at ASN, but of course our clinical domain work group leadership, but also being able to support our expert panel volunteer members to go to those other kidney conferences as well and really promote ClinGen's work. As Tam mentioned at the very start, all of the kidney disease clinical domain so far has been funded from one of the grants. We don't have any of our own individual funding for our expert panels or the clinical domain. So we are now investigating U24 opportunities and also partnering with those disease-specific organizations specifically for our VCEPs. There's some very clear outcomes there that would be beneficial. Publications is something that we've tried to think systematically about across the whole of the clinical domain. So we are in communication with one of the leading kidney journals for them to be our home for all of the kidney clinical domain work group publications. So all of the GCEP publications, likely the VCEP publications as well, and then any sort of general publications that come out of the clinical domain, for them all to be in one journal or at least family of journals as a series. So those talks so far are positive, but obviously nothing is in writing and finalized yet, but everyone seems really keen for that as an idea. And then very finally, to wrap up that disease naming conversation, this is obviously ongoing work, not just within our GCEP subdomains, but also that engagement I mentioned with the larger nephrology community. So clinicians through KDIGO who are dealing with it for their own individual disease areas, but also patient-specific groups as well who are trying to navigate through this process, and continuing our interactions with Mondo and OMIM and ClinGen's disease naming advisory committee as well, who obviously it's super beneficial to get their insights and also being able to hear more about the insights from across all of ClinGen's clinical domains. So that is all that we had. Tam, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything there.
No, that sounds good. I think I've got one question in the chat.
Oh,
which I can take unless anybody has any.
Yeah, go for it. And if anyone in the meantime, since we only have 5 minutes, has questions, feel free to stick it in the chat or once Tam's done talking to unmute and ask questions. And thank you, this was great. Clearly a Herculean effort in the kidney domain here.
Yeah, so Deb was asking a question about curating the Joubert syndrome genes. So yes, we started on those. As mentioned, we tackled the more isolated kidney disease focused genes first. And in terms of talking with the syndromic group, so obviously there are way more genes associated with syndromic disorders than there are with just specific kidney disease domain groups. So in terms of bandwidth, and kind of enthusiasm to curate, the syndromic group were quite happy for us to take on the Joubert, which also is, in the discussions we had, Joubert, Meckel, Senior Loken, they're all under a ciliopathy umbrella. So there wasn't really any splitting to be done. There was definitely lumping a lot of these. And ciliopathy was the term that we came up with as a more generalized term for those. In terms of choosing the genes, obviously, I was assigning the curations, so I would look in the gene tracker to see which of the kind of syndromic genes had the least number of claims, so that there was less work for me to have to go to each of those groups to see if it was okay for us to curate. And I believe we did do one joint curation. Somebody else can maybe speak to the function of the GCI, but I believe there is a way to have like acknowledge or attribute a second GCEP, which we did for at least one of those. Does that
Oh
answer your
yeah,
question?
that'd be great to know. How was that managed? I mean, I think at times when we've had that before between hereditary cancer and any other GCEP, we just kind of, you know, like duke it out, like who's gonna take this gene. So
Yeah, we've had, so, you know, depending on people's bandwidth. So I know the retina GCEP is very active, and they really wanted the body beetle syndrome genes.
okay.
So they like, they took those from us. Whereas we tried to offer the syndromic group, and they're like, no, if you want them, you take them. we have a lot to do. And obviously a lot of the kidney features are kind of clinically treatable. So our nephrologists have a lot of experience with the syndromic patients who have kidney disease. So we were comfortable, I guess, curating those.
I did have one other quick question. I don't want to like take it over if anyone else that has any. Well, okay, I'll go ahead. So for CACUT, the one that you mentioned, and it has 74 genes. So that's a lot of genes. Like, where did that, like, where'd you get all of those genes? And then is there like a smaller chunk within there that's really the ones that matter? And then the other ones you could just be like, well, like, you know, for motivation purposes, right? To get people working on a smaller, like more feasible set. So yeah, just where did the 74 come from?
So the 74 is already a smaller number. That is what the people on the call were excited to be curating. I think, I can't remember the note. There's like over 200 that have, and it's one of those associations where there are some very definitive, obviously we've not curated them yet within ClinGen, but there's some very clear associations there. And then there's others where people have, it's this sort of indeterminate phenotype. And so there's lots of publications out there where people have said, we did exome sequencing and we found this and it's a new cuckoo gene. No one has ever seen it before. So obviously those are also equally important for us to be curating so that we can dispute them. And so we tried to come up with, from this list of, I think there was over 200, I can't remember the exact number, that we whittled it down to 74, which were going to be the most definitive genes that the community has consensus on. And we just wanted a formal curation available for it. And then also those ones that really are disputed and, oh, no one in the community believes this, let's put a formal statement up about that. So we had already kind of tried to like, let's choose the ones that people are interested in and want to care about for that gene list, in the hope that that would make people turn up.
The small list is 74. Okay.
Well, yeah,
wow.
and then within 74, it's also split into the isolated cuckoo and the more syndromic cuckoo. So trying to focus first on just the isolated group, which I think was maybe like 15, 20 genes, thinking that the syndromic forms might be tackled by the syndromic GCEP before we get to it.
Great. Okay. Well, good to know. Good to know about like the prioritization. And I mean, I guess in hereditary cancer, we've typically had smaller, like 74 would be like an outside set for us, like a big set in the ones we've done prior to this. So great.
Great. Well, we are at time. So I want to thank Tam and Alicia again for giving this wonderful overview. And we will see everyone at the new time in the beginning of March. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.